Is moral realism necessary? I mean, is it even coherent? We're going to look at that today because it's one thing that I keep running across both in religious and secular discussions. It seems to be a moral religion of sorts, and that's kind of up our alley. So, do the moral realists have anything of substance to say? I'm going to go ahead right now and predict the answer to that is no. So, today we're going to be looking at an article from Philosophy Now written in 1993 by M.E. Fox and A.C.G.A. Diavalos called The Necessity of Moral Realism. Does anybody think that they're actually going to make a case for moral realism at all? Because I wouldn't be holding my breath on that one. This is one of the things that, if I didn't see this all the time from moral realists, I might not take it seriously, especially given the last line that reads, M.E. Fox is unemployed, and ACFA Diavalos has far too many initials to be taken seriously at all. However, lots of people seem to take this crap seriously, and so we're going to take a look regardless. If you want to know why lots of people think your philosophy is crap, yeah, watch on. Eating people is wrong is an indicative moral proposition rather than an imperative moral statement, such as you ought not eat people. Indicative moral propositions like eating people is wrong are meaningful and are truth accessible. The problem here is, how do you get to that? I mean, demonstrably not based on your fee-fees. This is something that comes up a lot, not only when talking to the religious, but just talking to random strangers online. The idea that there are things that are somehow objectively true, just because it happens to appeal to them on an emotional level, that's very, very commonplace. But that's not what truth is, and most of this is just emotional, not intellectual. There's no way to get from, well, I think this is true, to, here's the demonstration that this is actually true. It's why we have to keep going back to the definition of justified true belief. And for moral realists, it's the justified part that keeps getting them into the most trouble. So let's see what their argument is and why it doesn't actually work. The argument we shall advance in this paper is quite simple. It's that the meaningfulness of moral language presupposes the objective existence of moral properties. That is, if moral claims are the same sort of statements that can be in the first place either true or false, then it follows that some of them are in fact true. In other words, that moral skepticism is false. And that's not an argument. It's no more of an argument than saying Christianity presupposes the objective existence of Jesus. But that doesn't mean anything because presuppositions don't prove truth. That's the claim. It's not the justification of the claim. And for anything to be actually true, it has to be rationally justified and factually correct. Now, prove it, but they never can. The argument for this conclusion begins with a tautology, the statement that is necessarily true because it is logically impossible that it is false. Really? Prove it! This is the same thing that I've seen a lot of in Christianity. God must be real because we think it's logically impossible for God not to be real. Yeah, prove it! Your claims aren't the proof of your claims. They're just the claims. While they do go on and discuss this tautology, I have a sneaking suspicion that the entire justification for any of this is going to turn out to be faith down the line. But faith doesn't mean anything. I can already see where this is going to fail. The relevance of this tautology to ethics is revealed when P and Q are substituted by indicative moral propositions. In this case, P equals eating people is right, and Q equals eating people is wrong. The tautology can now be transformed into a true statement that has some relevance to the real world. Except it doesn't. It might have relevance to your own personal emotional state, but it doesn't actually have any relevance to the real world. There are, and certainly were historically, places in the world where eating people was just fine, whether for religious or for cultural reasons. How you personally react to that reality is completely irrelevant. You are asserting that a particular moral standard is the correct moral standard, not just for you, but for absolutely everybody, based entirely on your fifis, not on any kind of objectively verifiable evidence that you can present. Now, you can say that eating people might be unhealthy, especially if you're eating the brain, which leads to various prion diseases, etc., but not that it's objectively wrong, because you'd actually have to be able to define objectively wrong in some way that isn't just your fifis on display. Because here's another definition that we need to get out of the way. Objective means not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. Therefore, it doesn't matter if you're a human or a god or anything in between. Anything objective needs to exist in the universe entirely mind independent of any intelligent agent. So if a god created morals, then they are subjective because God created them. If man creates morals, which is what all the evidence we have points to, then they are subjective because man created them. You'd have to detail how it might happen independent of any mind, and so far, at least as far as I've ever seen, no moral realist can ever do that. The moral skeptic, however, holds that all moral propositions are false. It follows from this, if the skeptic is correct, that both P and Q are false because they are moral propositions. This in turn entails the truth of not P and not Q because the tautology in question is true. The skeptic therefore has to conclude that eating people is neither right or wrong. That means the same as eating people is not a moral issue. No, that is not remotely the case. Moral anti-realists like myself hold that moral propositions are just human inventions. They are the products of human cultures and human societies because humans collectively have decided that's how things ought to be. It's all entirely subjective. And that's why, if you look at different cultures around the world, you see different sets of moral structures. Different people, different views, entirely subjective. But that hurts a lot of people's fifis, which is why all of this ultimately comes down to that. They just don't like the idea that morality is variable, even though that's what all the evidence clearly shows. So they have to start making excuses and bald rationalizations for why they just have to be right. The religious just make up sin to explain why people stray from the one true path. But how is that rationally justified? It isn't. It just gets them somewhere that they desperately want to go, and secular moral realists, they're not any better. The skeptic can allow that some statements which use moral language are true. That is, he can accept the truth of the claim that eating people is not a moral issue because it is an amoral claim rather than a moral claim. No, I can allow that some statements which use moral language are useful but not true. Again, justified true belief. How are these claims actually justified? They're not. But we like it. Isn't a rational justification. This is really where they just start playing word games, just like the religious do. It's musical definition time, because we're not saying that eating people isn't a moral issue. We're just saying that it's not an objective moral issue. If you lived in a tribe where cannibalism was practiced, then you'd believe that cannibalism was just fine. Why? because that's what your culture and what your society has decided. And in cultures and societies where it's not acceptable, you are programmed from near birth to think that it's not acceptable. The same goes for any moral precept. It's why religion works the way that it does. Program an innocent mind to accept things uncritically, and it's damn hard to get rid of them down the road. Note that I'm not saying that all childhood indoctrination is inherently evil. There are some things that you absolutely need to know and accept in order to fit into your culture. It's just when those things are not defensible, when they are not demonstrably true, that you're going to have some problems. And that's why it's so important to be able to take a giant step back and ask what's really going on here. And sadly, there's an awful lot of people out there who can't. However, the skeptic holds that it is not only the activity of eating people that is neither right nor wrong. Rather, he holds that all actions are amoral. No moral issues exist. All is amorality. And this is a complete straw man. We don't say that it's neither right nor wrong. We say that it isn't objectively right or wrong. There is a difference. These ideas are all subjective. We made them up because they provide some kind of supposed benefit to society. Whether that benefit is defensible or not, that's something else to talk about. But it definitely provides an underpinning for society, and that's useful. The problem with humans, generally speaking, is that we happen to be intellectually lazy. We don't really like to have to think. We'd rather just accept something eternally as true rather than have to work it all out for ourselves. That's why we tend to educate our children the way that we do. And it's not just kids, we do it with everyone. But the methodology is all the same. Here's how you do it. Don't ask questions, just do it this way. This is right, and everything else is wrong. Do what I tell you to do, and don't bother to think for yourself. Now, some people learn the basics of critical thinking when they get to college, but by then, usually the damage is already done. Uninitiated human minds tend to cling to whatever they learn at a very young age and take it as true, whether it's actually true or not. It's why getting away from religion is often very hard, because it forms a foundational part of who you are as a person. It becomes part of your own self-image. And that's done on purpose, but it's not the only place that it's done. We really ought to be teaching kids critical thinking skills from a very young age, but most people don't want that because it's a challenge to their supremacy and to their authority. So those same foundational myths continue to get passed on verbatim. Unfortunately, as it stands, the skeptic's position is literally meaningless. And, of course, that's fear talking. If what we believe isn't automatically true, we're not going to know what to do with ourselves. And that's especially true in religion. It's why don't question and don't doubt is part of nearly every religious creed. Just believe. But that's stupid. Anyway, they continue. The terms moral and amoral are classificatory devices. They exist as categories into which actions and activities and even people are sorted. Sure, but that's not really what we're talking about here, is it? This is something that I've noticed about moral realists. They don't want to have to talk about objectivity, which is the core of the problem. They don't ever want to have to discuss it. Yet the very definition of moral realism is the position that ethical sentences express propositions that refer to objective features of the world. And we already talked about what objective is. That's why they spend so much time running around with the goalposts, screaming that they're right, just like the religious do. The religious, they don't want to talk about evidence. They have none. Therefore, they're just running around talking about faith and feelings and all that nonsense because they have nothing else to do. Moral realists are pretty much the same. You just know that it's true. No, I don't, and neither do you. You have to do a whole lot better than that. And it's really too bad that they can't. Because here's something else that you ought to pay attention to, which is true of this article. They don't talk about the defense for moral realism. Ever. Not ever. They just assume that it's true. All they do is point at the other side and say, see, they're wrong. Well, even if the other side is wrong, that doesn't make you right, because they don't actually care any more than the religious do. They just want to be right because it makes them happy. But if it's stupid for religion, it's stupid for philosophy, maybe doubly so. So, you people need to knock that off. All actions, then, fall under one or other of the two headings, moral and amoral. But that's not the topic of a discussion, is it? We're talking about whether moral and amoral are objective or subjective in nature. Nobody in their right minds say that there are no moral precepts at all. It's where do they come from and how are they justified, and the moral realists don't want to talk about that, do they? In fact, every time I bring that up in a discussion with a moral realist, they crap their pants and change the subject. Did you ever notice that? It happens with the religious too, as I said, because this is an entirely emotional proposition, not an intellectual one. Because these two groups are very much the same. They desperately want things to be true without being able to justify them as actually true. Remember, justified true belief. It just doesn't work that way very often when it comes to these groups, does it? Then the article gets into quibbling over words while ignoring the basic concepts, so we're just going to skip over that part. You'll notice that a lot of philosophers do this, don't you? Where they'll get so buried in the minutiae that they just haul out their thesauruses and start flapping their lips while not actually saying anything of substance. Most philosophy papers would be half the length if you just cut out the BS and got down to the nitty-gritty. I don't know if they think they're getting paid by the word or what, but anyway, let's continue. In the light of these considerations, the skeptic's view that all is amorality appears rather fragile. But that's just a straw man, isn't it? Here's something else you'll notice if you actually delve into this. Moral realists spend all of their time attacking their detractors, and as I said, they never ever spend any time actually defending their own position. They're automatically right because, you guessed it, fifis! They don't actually have any support. They can't actually defend themselves. And it's why creationists, for example, do the same thing. They can't defend their own views, so they spend all of their time making up nonsense about so-called evolutionists. Sorry, but evolution has nothing at all to do with you. Defend your own views. They can't, which is why they always turn to attack, just like the moral realists do. And that's kind of sad, huh? This is how you know that you're talking to a dumbass. All fifis, all faith, no facts whatsoever. Put on airs of intellectuality, but don't actually demonstrate that you know what the hell you're talking about. Create straw men and run around with the goalposts. It's really all they can do. It's really stupid, though, when you think about it, and it all comes down to one question. Can you show that there is an objective, mind-independent morality? Back it up with evidence. Go ahead, because if you can't, then you're just wasting everybody's time. And that's all moral realism does. It's just fifis over facts. And that's the same problem that we have with the religious, isn't it? Maybe they should figure this stuff out before they make such fools of themselves. So we're going to jump down a little because the rest of this is just more goalpost track and field. We're going to see that philosophers do the same things that the religious get criticized for all the time. Why? Because I don't think they even know what they're doing wrong, and I don't think they care either. Moving down to a section called Meaning and Skepticism, they say the truth of moral realism follows logically from the meaningfulness of ethics and the truth accessibility of moral propositions. Consider the following set of statements, and we'll get into that in a second, but see if you can guess what they're doing wrong from the very first word, and yes, that's a hint. So starting off, If eating animals is wrong, then eating dogs is wrong. Eating dogs is wrong. Eating dogs is not wrong. Okay, great, whatever. If. Now, prove your if is a because. Granted, this is just an example, but this is the same kind of thing that the religious do all the time. If eating animals is wrong, well, prove that's the case. You're certainly welcome to think that it's wrong. You can think whatever you like, but you can't actually demonstrate that it is, because none of this is objective. Morality is subjective. If you go somewhere where eating dogs is perfectly fine, then guess what? It's perfectly fine. You might not like it, you don't have to, but nobody's asking your opinion. If you go someplace that throwing gay people off of roofs is perfectly fine, then yeah, that's perfectly fine too, to the people within that culture. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, and it doesn't mean there might not be some consequences to those actions, but the moral aspects remain entirely subjective. This is something a lot of people really hate, but hating things doesn't actually change reality. That's a lesson that a lot of people desperately need to learn. This is internally inconsistent. However, it's not clear that the skeptic can make any sense of the contradiction. If he assigns the truth value of falsehoods to the above statements, then the if-then relation doesn't hold, and consequently, the conjunction of the other two false statements is not inconsistent. And there they go again, simply assuming objectivity, because truth value in this case is subjective. You might not like that, but too bad. That's why I only talked about the first premise and not the conclusion. The entire thing is just an emotional screed and an attack on their detractors. Not once have they ever produced a single thing in favor of their own views. If you go and look at the long series of posts I had on my blog on moral realism, I point this out repeatedly. They're not getting to moral realism intellectually. They're getting there emotionally, just like the religious are, because this is, at its core, a religious-style position to hold. Not that they care, of course, but they should. Because if this is the best they can do, then their philosophy is entirely meaningless. M.E. Fox and ACFA Diavolos have done absolutely nothing here but make complete fools of themselves. And, of course, we know the response that we'd get if we pointed that out. Well, you just don't understand. Because you haven't done anything worthwhile. You haven't done anything worth understanding. That's the same thing that all the woo-mongers say, from religion to Bigfoot believers to alien abduction idiots. We don't understand because you don't make any sense. You haven't said anything of substance. You just make empty, emotionally comforting claims and expect everybody to take you at your word. And we're not going to do that, sorry. The problem here isn't us. It's you. Do better. So we're going to jump all the way to the very end because they spend the rest of this just whining about how much they don't like the opposition. Sorry, but not liking something doesn't make it wrong. Your performance here is piss poor at best. Anyhow, the meaningfulness of moral language presupposes the truth of moral realism. It presupposes the existence of moral properties and entails the existence of moral facts, true moral claims. That is, the doubts that the skeptic entertains are meaningful if and only if they are necessarily groundless. Presuppositions don't get you anywhere. That's religious language right there, because this is, in essence, a religion. I mean, it doesn't have any of the God beliefs, but it's acting in the exact same way, presuming that it's right before it ever demonstrates that it's right, because it really, really wants to be right. Well, guess what? That doesn't make you right. If you're actually looking for truth, which, let's be honest, they're not, they just want comfort, then you shouldn't behave like this. But what else do they have? It's not like they have any evidence. They certainly don't have any reason. They just have wishful thinking and blind faith, and that's not remotely enough. Now, I'm sure that the moral realists will have all kinds of excuses for why their side failed once again. We just don't understand, some crap like that. But we've already addressed that. The failures are on their side, not ours. They're just mad that we're not coming to the same conclusions that they are. And the religious do the exact same thing. Well, too bad. You have to do better. Come up with some actual support for your side beyond your feelings. Because your feelings don't count. Your feelings don't matter. This was just pathetic. Just like moral realism.